Hi, well, a warm welcome to everyone. I think today's session on reaching a 1 trillion digital economy can be seen as part of the Prime Minister's goal of India reaching a $5 trillion economy. I think ambitious goals, of course, the great thing about such ambitious goals is that it focuses people's minds on how to get to that particular goal. Uh, Ideally, there should be some timeline attached to it, but we'll let that pass for the time being. Uh, Apart from creating high growth companies and well-paying jobs, the great advantage of digital is that it's also a force multiplier for the economy. Uh, for example, we have seen how the unified payment interface has reduced friction in sending and receiving money. If you look at this goal of reaching a 1 trillion economy, India has got many of the essential ingredients for attaining that goal. I'll list out 5 of them. One is we have very high internet and smartphone penetration. We have a very vibrant entrepreneurial ecosystem. I think till this year, the year is not yet ended, but we have already minted about 42 unicorns in India. We have a young tech-savvy population. The Indian government has a strong focus on digitization. The Prime Minister himself is an extremely digitally savvy person. And the last bit is that we have built some really interesting public digital infrastructure for identity, payments, and data called India Stack. So Aadhaar, eKYC, and e-signature are the identity layer. UPI is the payment layer. The account aggregator is the layer for data sharing. So between all these, I think we have some really powerful tools for reaching this $1 trillion goal. The last bit of this is not so well known. So I'm going to take a minute to, just add a little bit here. A venture capitalist that I spoke to, one of the most senior venture capitalists in India, he said that digital businesses get a greater valuation because they can scale much faster than physical businesses. And he said that because India has built this public digital infrastructure called India Stack, he would assign India a higher multiple if India was a private company, because India Stack enables the ecosystem to go digital much faster. So basically, I think this is something that very few people really understand. However, one person who would really understand this really well is Mrs. Arundhati Bhattacharya, because she was the chairman of State Bank of India at a time when UPI was launched in 2016. And very few people know the fact that if it wasn't for the kind of strong support that Mrs. Bhattacharya had given UPI in the early days, it wouldn't be where it is. We recently saw last month, November 2021, 4.1 billion transactions happening on UPI. I think roughly a value of about $110 billion. So if it wasn't for that early support from State Bank of India and Mrs. Bhattacharya, that would not have happened. We also have Manish Sabharwal, who has been writing about some of these developments. One of the rare businessmen who writes a lot on public policy issues. Also been on the board of the Reserve Bank of India. So I think we have two people who are highly qualified to discuss this particular topic today. So let me, without much further ado, come to you, Manish. Last month you wrote an article in Indian Express, and I quote you. You say that economic magic needs an engine firing on all 3 cylinders, and the 3 cylinders being the private sector, the non-profits, and the government. And you explained why Geo lowering the data rates, why UPI reducing friction in low volume transactions, and GST driving formalization of the economy is a triad that basically leads to inclusion and prosperity. You also quoted estimates that say that the startup ecosystem is going to explode in valuation from $315 billion today to about $1 trillion in 2025. So most of these startups anyway are born digital. So, since you said that 1 trillion by 2025, do you think that the 1 trillion goal is not very ambitious? I'm trying to provoke you a little bit here, but, over to you, Manish.
Thanks, Venkatesh. One of my favorite generals says plans are useless, but planning is indispensable. And I think that sort of is your goal setting in an economy with infinite potential is really more art than science, right? And I was intrigued by your comment of the PM's $5 trillion target, and you said, well, there should be a timeline to it. The fact that we can talk about a 5 trillion target is quite remarkable, right? I landed for my MBA in August 1994 in the US, and there was a front page article on the Wall Street Journal, which said that India is more interesting than important. I hope that journalist is eating the newspaper on which he wrote that, because what's happening in India is not once in a decade or once in a millennium. It's really once in the lifetime of a country, right? But if you wanted to examine whether 1 trillion was too high or too low, there would only be two frameworks, right? It would be luck or it would be skill. Is India the next 20 years, is it going to be luck or skill? And I think there are three elements of luck in this, right? There is a global glut of capital. 40% of the world's bonds are trading at less than 1% interest rate. 20% of the world's bonds are trading at at negative interest rate. So obviously we will overvalue growth. And India is one of the few countries in the world with 20 years of growth ahead of it, with more than 100 million people, right? I think there is China, Deng Xiaoping has made a list of everything that, Xi Jinping has made a list of everything that Deng Xiaoping did right, and he is crossing each one of them off one by one. So that's a wonderful bout of luck for India. But I think the new world of work, if you're working from Chicago for a New York company, you can be working from anywhere. Work from home can be work from anywhere. So there's a new world of work, there's a new world of organizations, and there's a new world of education. And that plays to somebody like India who came late to the party. So I think there's a bunch of luck we have. Obviously, this $1 trillion economy does depend on this, I would say, opening balance of formalization, urbanization, industrialization, financialization, and human capital that we have sort of done for ourselves in the last few years. I think that IT employment is going from 5 million to 10 million, right? Nobody can doubt that. I mean, this year, India will export more software than Saudi Arabia will oil. Now that you have to process what that means, because all of us have grown believing Saudi Arabia is unbeatable, but 5 million Indians out of our 1.3 billion population and 500 million labor force are going to export more 160, 70, 180 billion dollars of software, which is more than what Saudi Arabia will oil. But I do think we're not out of the woods yet. We do have challenges. I mean, our human capital continues to be a challenge at the school level. I think we do need civil service reform. We can't have 67,000 compliances and 26,400 ways to go to jail embedded in those 67,000 compliances. So the regulatory cholesterol has to come down, and obviously infrastructure has to be built out. But I would say, even if we get to this 1 trillion, life is about compounding. It's not about I think the compounding has begun. That's really important here. So the 1 trillion is doable. Can we do much more than that? Absolutely. I mean, India and China have the same per capita GDP as recently as 1991. They are now 5 times more than us. And so, Shama Shobhati us bhujang ko jiske paas garal ho, right? My favorite poet, he says that only snakes with venom can be kind, benevolent, or generous. And, I think after a long time, I feel that the economic prosperity, which was left out of the equation after independence, will give us the strength for not 1 trillion. I mean, we'll probably, only Japan and Germany are ahead of us. US is 24 trillion total GDP. China is 14 trillion. So in a few years, it'll just be a 3-legged race, right? And then we can think about compounding even further.
Yeah. Thanks, Manish. I'll come back to the point on regulatory cholesterol in the latter part of this. But let me now turn to Mrs. Bhattacharya. Ultimately, finance is the lifeblood of an economy. And In your career, you have seen some tectonic shifts in the financial sector. It's no exaggeration to say that India is one of the most modern financial ecosystem in the world. I think the digitization of finance in India is far, far ahead of the rest of the world. I think a lot of people still don't realize that even in the US, instantaneous money transfer is not a possibility. So I think this is it's not a factor that's well understood. You have had a vantage point because of your long career, 3 decades plus at State Bank of India. Can you explain what digitization, the infrastructure that we have built in India Stack, etc., means for this goal of India being a 5 trillion economy and 1 trillion in digital economy? You're on mute, madam.
Sorry. As I said, absolutely. But before I do that, I must tell Mr. Sabharwal, I love the phrase regulatory cholesterol. I think I'm going to use it in various other places. I hadn't heard that one before. But, Venkatesh, you talked about what we did for UPI. But even before that, what we did was the Prime Minister Dhan and Jam Trinity. Please don't forget that, because that was the time when every single family in India, at least 98.7% of them, got a bank account. And remember that India doesn't allow you to keep money in any other form other than in banks. So it doesn't stay stored as stock time. We don't allow the crypto. So there is no other storage of value. It has to ultimately be backed up by a bank account. And it's not as though, we were not trying financial inclusion, earlier. We've been trying financial inclusion for 14 years before we actually did the PMJDY. But what was the difference in the Prime Minister Jan Dhan Yojana? And there, it is what was called the Jam Trinity, which is obviously, the Jan Dhan Yojana itself. A stands for Aadhaar, which is the UID platform, the Unique Identification Authority platform, and M is the mobile. So basically, again, you will find over here, it was the triad that was working, because the mobile connectivity was mainly brought in by the private sector. The Aadhaar was a government-led initiative. And again, Jan Dhan, that is the account, was delivered by both private and public sector, mainly by the public sector, but yes, the private sector also had a part to play. But what really helped us in doing the PMJDY so successfully was the fact that we had the Aadhaar platform and we had the communications. Without that, it wouldn't have happened. It would have been the same problem that we had 14 years back. And the reason for that is, in a bank account, you need a know your customer. That means you need to be able to identify a customer. In India, where we have so much of unorganized labor and so much of migration of labor, it's impossible to identify a person until you have that biometric database that can deduplicate and give you a number and give you the entire identification details in all of 30 seconds. So in all of 30 seconds, with just the scan of a finger and the typing in of the number, you can download not only the picture, but the address. You can get everything of that particular person. And that's an individual who will be that individual. He cannot be somebody else. So you can't change names, you can't change spellings, you can't do anything in order to take on another identity, right? So that was something that is so powerful. And when we actually did this entire job, in a matter of 7 months, we opened 115 million accounts. Mind you, 115 million accounts just by our bank alone, okay? And the fact was that, 97% of these accounts were zero balance. When I checked about maybe 9 months back, those accounts had $14.2 billion in balance. So that shows you the amount of money or the amount of economic opportunity that was falling by the way, and that what exclusion was actually doing to our economy. With the coming in of the PMJDY and with the infrastructure that came with it, because PMJDY also mandated that all of us had to give cards, that is, the debit cards, to the people so that they could use them on POS machines, not necessarily ATMs, or go to a bank, use them on the POS machines so that they could easily deposit money and take out money. That ease of doing business that came in, ease of banking that came in, caused these amounts to flow in. And once the money starts flowing in into your account, and that you are going to get a certain amount of income every month, it enables then the banking system to leverage this and give you the kind of capital you require in order to start all of these small businesses, to start actually raising your standard of living. Not only that, the direct benefit transfers that the government was giving, there's a huge leakage that was going on. And I'll just tell you one small story. For instance, the prices of our cooking gas cylinders was heavily subsidized. Okay. Now, there are a lot of people in India who don't really need that subsidy, but because it was subsidized, all of us were getting it. All right. So what the government did was the government said, let's link it to a bank account. We will now make it, market price, but the subsidy will still come into your bank account. Overnight, 150 million connections became 110 million, or maybe 130 million. Okay. So 20 million customers who were actually commercial and should not have been using that subsidy, they stopped getting that subsidy. So to that extent, the leakage from the government stopped. Similarly, then the government went again and said, now we need those accounts to be Aadhaar linked. So in Aadhaar linked, you can get only one account, right? That the numbers that were there, 130 million, dropped further to 110 million. So, you can see the amount of subsidy that was saved, the amount of leakage that was happening. And that leakage now can be used in far more purposeful ways in order to really address the people who need them. Okay. And then thereafter, with all of this infrastructure that got built up, with the POS machines, with the cards, with the accounts, then you get the UPI. And again, in the UPI, this is, I think, the only system in the world where you can have the app of, say, Bank A, and you can connect it to your account in Bank B. Send money to somebody who has an app of Bank C, connected to his or her account in Bank D. All of this will happen real time. It needs 14 hops. We'd actually calculated at that point of time how many hops there are. And as you know, any fluctuation anywhere, the hops can get cancelled or they can abort. But we also ensured that there would be no reconciliation issues, because if a hop gets aborted at one point of time, it just hops back to the original. Okay. So at the end of the day, there is nothing in the pipeline. And obviously there were issues. There are some failures still, but those numbers are so few considering the volumes that we are handling. It's something which I would say is really and truly empowering. And I agree with your comment there, saying that, people don't really understand where our banking system has gone. Today, for instance, you have what are called the Open Credit Enablement Network, or they are in short form called the Open Rails. With the Open Credit Enablement Network, any banker can get in over there, find out the details of people who are presenting them the bills, and they will get, customized data coming from very many sources, including the GSTN. Okay, so you can get the sources, you can get the amount of data that people, about how much people are taking as taxes, paying as taxes, how much they are actually spending on certain items. So, what has happened is that the underwriting, which was very, very poor if you do it manually, that underwriting has become very rich. And the richer it becomes, the more risk mitigated your activities become in finance. And the more risk mitigation interest rate as everybody else. So to that extent,
question. Sorry, did
it drop in the middle?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. I just wanted to quickly ask you, what does that mean for, the goal of reaching a 1 trillion economy in the next?
Frankly speaking, I think that's a no-brainer. And I agree with Mr. Sabharwal, it's an absolute no-brainer. You look at India, in India, by 2030, India will have about 370 million Generation Z customers, okay? Next only to China, right? And of these, they will be between the ages of 10 to 25. They would have grown up in an India which is with ubiquitous internet, smartphones, digital media, digital consumption platforms. And as they start consuming, earning, and spending, they will actively use technology that has enabled these consumption models. And in turn, they will influence consumption behavior of their households. India today is already, Mr. Sabharwal was saying about 5 million people. I agree with him that that headcount will double. Even for a smaller company like Salesforce, in the 20 months that I have been in this company, and this is throughout the pandemic, believe me, we have more than doubled headcount in India alone. And that is not only true of our company, all of the companies that we work with, our entire ecosystem is simply looking for talent. Even today, I think I can straight away bet that there are at least 20,000 Salesforce jobs that are open in India, right? So India is actually, working for the world. My one small, contention here is that while, we are working for the world, we are not working that much for the traditional industry in India. So Indian traditional industry needs to really and truly up its game. I would say the finance sector is digitally very savvy, but you look at the other traditional sectors of manufacturing. Don't look at the startup ecosystem. They are hugely IT savvy, but look at traditional industry. And traditional industry is where, I would like to hear a little more about is regulatory cholesterol, because that's where, we are stuck. We need Indians and as Indian industry to take up this evolution at a much faster pace than what we are doing right now. And the sad part is we have all the talent, we have all the manpower, we are doing it for the world. We are not doing the same thing for India itself.
Madam, that's a great segue to my next question, which is on, what are the bottlenecks that we need to eliminate and, what do we need to kind of accelerate the revolution? When it comes to software, we have done extremely well. Software is one of the pillars along with hardware, but on the hardware pillar, we have not really done too well. I think we are still not Atmanirbhar or self-sufficient on the hardware front. Your point that, we have done great for, deploying all this for the external world outside India is well taken, because I remember meeting FC Kohli, the father of the Indian software industry. And he said that, we've done software exports fantastically well, but, one of the things that he wanted NASSCOM to take up is a mission of creating software in Indian languages, fonts and technologies and translation engines. We are still not focused on, what IT can do for the 90% of Indians who do not speak English. The other challenges I see are, when it comes to entrepreneurs, they want predictability and stability in policies, and which is where, the regulatory cholesterol and the issue that Manish spoke about comes in. I think many, for example, some blockchain startups that I know, they chose to register themselves in Singapore and other geographies rather than India because they don't know what the policy is going to be like. The other thing I feel maybe we could do better is, having an office of technology forecasting, which will say that these are the technologies of the future and invest heavily in it. So the Chinese government, for example, said that AI is going to be the industry of the future. And they invested heavily in that area. The net result of it today is that almost 25% of the research papers in AI today come out of China. So, things like quantum computing, et cetera, et cetera. So I think the question for both of you is, what do we need to do as a country to start punching way above the level that we are punching today? Maybe Manish could start off.
So I think you had three questions. One was manufacturing, one was stability, and one was sort of forecasting investment. Let me sort of think about each one. So, manufacturing obviously has been a challenge for India. Only 11% of our labor force is employed in manufacturing. But you must remember manufacturing has changed. So the peak of any country's labor force in manufacturing was Britain in World War II. It was 45%. America peaked at 33, China peaked at 28. I don't think we're ever going to get to 45, 33, or 28, but 11% is the wrong number. And for the interim Make in India is becoming Make for India. So if you look at the $84 billion of FDI last year, it is clustered in areas where domestic consumption is getting to critical mass. So I think that related to this manufacturing, I mean, you can just contrast the STP policy and the SEZ policy, right? STP was for software guys, low regulatory cholesterol, trust, while SEZ assumes that everybody's a chore. It assumes it is massively criminalized, you know. So I think this regulatory cholesterol question is related to manufacturing, right? So for many years, all of us obsessed about the ease of doing business rankings of the World Bank, which have now been scrapped, but it was always didn't involve employers. It was always just people sitting in a room looking at data, and there was no. So last year we put out a report where we listed. I was getting tired of the government telling us that, look, nobody has this data. So we listed it: 67,000 compliances, 6,700 filings, and there are 26,410 criminal provisions embedded in this. Now, obviously, this doesn't apply to one company, right? Because it depends on the sector, depends on how many states, half of it is state, half of it is center. So I think that if you really want manufacturing to take off, you need a very new regulatory regime for that. I think the infrastructure and human capital are always binding constraints, but they're binding constraints in America also. You can always get better at human capital. You can always get better at infrastructure. But regulatory cholesterol is a uniquely Indian innovation after the 1955 Avadi Resolution or the 1956 Second Five-Year Plan. Essentially, India's capital is handicapped without labor, and our labor is handicapped without capital. We have 63 million enterprises, but we only have 23,500 companies with a paid up capital of more than 10 crores. So I think the manufacturing question is related to the regulatory cholesterol. I think, just-in-time supply chains are becoming just-in-case supply chains. Everybody's worried about China. This is our opportunity. I've met 50 factory refugees, if you want to call them, who are looking to run away from China and maybe come to India. They thought they would do Vietnam and Thailand, but those are subscale. So I think if we give them less regulatory cholesterol, will be. Your stability point, I mean, macroeconomics, you're wrong, because the last 5 years have been the first time where dollar returns have equaled rupee returns for foreign investors. Now, people underestimate the impact of that in investor psyche. So last 5 years, a dollar investor and a rupee investor made the same amount of money because of the rupee being stable. I think the regulatory arbitrage is also coming down, right? I mean, we had all worried about the IPO market getting offshore, but clearly the multiples in India are higher. Okay? And you must recognize pharma and software, which are two important parts of India's stock market. The multiples in India are higher than they would be if they were listed in the US. These same companies. So, you can talk about running away from India, but your multiple will go down to half. Pfizer trades at half the multiple of all the Indian pharma companies. So you have to be careful with this whole, we need no laws in India there, and we need to sort of, just sort of a race to the bottom. So I think there is a clear case that regulatory predictability in India with GST has increased. I think with getting rid of the retrospective taxation, there is at least a public declaration that we will not move to that. I worry about your third question about an Office of Technology Forecasting, right? Because India's seen that movie before. We called it The License Raj, and that was a horror movie. It ended quite badly for us. All predictive models 20, 30 years out, I have studied all of them about jobs, have the efficacy of palm reading or astrology, right? What I would submit is you need a self-healing ecosystem. The three pillars have three deficits. The private sector has a trust deficit, the government has an execution deficit, and nonprofits have a scale deficit. And so if you want to make the system self-healing, let's everybody drive in their lane. The government should, like selling Air India is a very substantial statement of strategy more than the money received. I mean, the government only paid 2.5 crores to buy Air India, but it burnt 1.1 lakh crores in the last 11 years, incinerated 1.5 lakh crores in the last 12 years to keep Air India. So I would say, I wouldn't be so much into this industrial strategy that China has about artificial intelligence. I'd say make the SEZ policy equal to the STP policy in its simplicity and trust. Let's raise our human capital, let's lower the regulatory cholesterol, and we're on our way.
Okay. I think I like the way you framed the fact that the private sector has a trust deficit, the government has an execution deficit, and the NGO sector has a scale deficit. I think with all the changes that we have seen, I think the NGO sector, the non-profit sector scale deficit is going to be even worse, I suppose. But I want to move to Mrs. Bhattacharya. What in your view do we need to do to really punch way above the current level that we are punching at?
So one, of course, I think the priority is to build up the digital infrastructure itself. If you look at the communication infrastructure, I got cut off in the middle of what I was saying because the internet obviously went on a blip, okay, for a second or two. Now that should not be happening, because if this was between a UPI transaction, mind you, that transaction would have dropped and it would have aborted, okay? So you do need stable infrastructure. And at this point of time, the amount that we need to spend on creating that infrastructure is a challenge, but should not be one. There are ways and means by which this infrastructure can definitely be funded, and then funded in a profitable manner with a rate of return on it. And if this is done, then it can increase our productivity and efficiency enormously. But I think, the Indian infrastructure, the digital infrastructure, or even the other infrastructure, overall, I think there is a deficit there, and we really need to work on how we bring this together. There again, I do believe that, we need to have a single window for all infrastructure projects. Infra projects at this point of time, even if it is, not digital infrastructure, it's pure infrastructure like, building of roads or building of any core industries. The number of ministries and the number of agencies involved, and I'm sure Mr. Sabharwal would be able to quickly tell you the exact numbers, they are just enormous. The ease of business, if you actually get down to it, is really and truly difficult. You look at any cloud service provider for that matter, and the kind of hoops that they have to run through before, they even get anywhere close to offering their services. And this I say from experience. So to that extent, this is definitely a barrier that needs to be taken care of. I think the other very, very important thing is the skill gap. We really and truly need to ensure we have the people, we have the talent. But what we really don't have is proper, skilling programs that ensures that we are actually bringing out market-ready, industry-ready individuals. India is the only country in the world that is graduating close to 1 million engineers a year. There is no other country that is, graduating that many engineers. And given the fact that, engineers will be required in whatever technology that we choose to implement, it may be AI, it may be robotics, it may be machine learning, it could be your blockchain technology, whatever technology you need people, you need skilled people, and you need the higher skills. Again, believe me, the talent is very much available in India, and we've seen how quickly they can scale. But we don't have the proper system of doing it at scale and as fast as we need them to happen. And if you look at one of these reports that came, I think it was IDC that did it, that said, the impact on GDP of non-skilling at the right time will be the maximum for India, decreasing India's GDP to the extent of 2.3%. And we are the country that has the highest impact for this. Yeah. So, you have the people, you have the talent, but you don't have the ways of skilling them in the right skill sets. That's not going to work. And again, without infrastructure, you will not be able to get even the primary education at the level you want out there into the rural areas where people may not really be able to move. In fact, in many forums, I have said that the government should stop, thinking about giving people only, especially students, only bicycles. They need to now give them iPads, and they need to give them some kind of a subsidy in order to have a broadband connection. That's the only way. Otherwise, imagine the number of student days that have been lost because these students had no way of accessing any kind of learning in the last 2 years. So I think that's another very major area where we need to work. And of course, regarding the ease of doing business, as I have said, today, for instance, if you look at the procurement policy, it has certain requirements for components, a majority component to be made in India. Now, if you look at companies such as ours that have R&D centers here, R&D centers abroad, how do you determine which product, how much of it is done in India? Yeah. This is not a discrete manufacturing where you can say product A, B, C, D sourced in India, the rest of it sourced from here, and therefore 51% is sourced in India. How do you find out how much of the contribution has come from abroad and how much has come from India? Now, what is the end result of this? The end result of it is procurement in many of these areas has just stopped. Now, who is suffering from it? It's Indian industry that's suffering from it. So we have to have, logical policies that ensure that our industry gets the best and gets the best from wherever it is available. Because at the end of the day, this century will be ours, but we have to prepare ourselves for it. If we are not preparing ourselves for it, then there's no way that it's going to happen. So I think, all of these things, they definitely need prioritization and they definitely need working on in a collaborative manner so that, we can ultimately, deliver these things.
Yeah. I want to pick two phrases from what you said and, run them past Manish. One is you said, that we have to build policies in a collaborative way. And the second is you said, we need to have logical policies. So Manish, you have observed the policy ecosystem in India for a long time. Why is it that policies are not collaborative? I mean, right now, for example, there is the crypto policy and nobody knows what the contours of it. There's not even a draft out there for public discussion. So that's one example. Is it a trust deficit? And I think one thing I see when I read Indian policies is they are not very well drafted. The language of the draft reports, the precision. Why is that so? How can we fix? How can we make it better drafted? How can we make it more collaborative as a process? If there is a trust deficit, how can we bridge that?
I mean, I think you're talking about the fixed costs of democracy. There are fixed costs of democracy. Everybody, one of the biggest questions I have in policy often is how do I get something done when everybody who matters in government agrees with me, right? Apprenticeship Act was the 20th point in Indira Gandhi's 20-point program in 1975. You could change the date on the Kothari Committee report of 1968 and not go wrong in higher education. So there are a few things which slow down policy. One is we genuinely are a democracy. So at some point, anybody can say no and nobody can say yes. Is complicated for India. And I've seen it in interministerial consultations, 31 ministries may say yes, one will say no, and it goes into cold storage, right? So I mean, whether that should be allowed or not should be allowed, what is representative, that's a, I mean, half the time this government is criticized for being too dictatorial, so you can't criticize them for being not consultative. You have to make up your mind which one it is. Either they don't listen or they listen too much is unfair. I think, there are only 8 cabinet ministers in Japan, there are only 14 cabinet ministers in the US, and there are only 22 in UK. We have 75 ministers, we have 57 ministries, and we have 200 departments in Delhi. Most tragically, we have 250 people in Delhi with the rank of Secretary to Government of India. We should have 10. It just makes no sense to have 250 people with the rank of Secretary. So we have a sprawl across ministries. We have too much at the top. So I think civil service reform, the steel frame has become a steel cage. I think that is an important part of the reform which has not happened. See, businessmen's lives has changed substantially since 91. Before 1991, Indian businessmen didn't have clients, we had hostages. It was called the license Raj. After 2009 or 2010, politics has become very competitive. whatever you say, whoever is. So politicians' lives has changed, but civil servants' life has not changed. Most of them are, 99.9% of the Indian administrative service is ranked outstanding. That's mathematically impossible, right?
Absolutely.
Everybody can't be above average. So unfortunately, that's true for most civil service institutions. So I'd say performance management, the kernel threshold of the army, there are many ideas for civil service reform, but I think the bold, we need a more adventurous state, but you won't have an adventurous state with the structure that was set up for the license Raj. So I think the overhaul of Indian business, which has happened, all the Modis, Bangurs, Lohia, Singhanias, which ruled India in the license Raj are gone now. And they're the new breed of companies. I think that's happening in financial services. But I would submit that one of the biggest agendas of unfinished reform is civil service reform. And that is something that is, can't be done in an instant. There is the Mission Karmyogi, which has now been set up. It's focused on capacity building, but you will need to link the capacity building to structure, to performance management, and even to repair, prepare, and upgrade, which is the human capital in government. So all that you mentioned is really now becoming there is no HR in government, right? And so human capital in government has diminished substantially, at least in the bureaucracy in the last 10, 15, 20 years for various reasons. If you treat Gadha Ghoda equally, it is the Gadha who celebrates and the Ghoda who gets frustrated, right?
So Manish, what you say reminds me of I think it was one of the IT exhibitions in Delhi, Pragati Maidan in 1997. And Shamal Ghosh was the telecom secretary. And that was the time when India was winning the Miss World and the Miss Universe. And so Shamal Ghosh basically said that we are winning in IT and beauty because there's no Ministry of IT and there's no Ministry of Beauty. So that's, of course, a bit of a light-hearted comment. But one question.
No, I think I just wanted to pause you there because Indian cricket really improved after the IPL came.
Yes.
Because the IPL is the ultimate meritocracy.
Yes.
Right? You have people from small towns here. I don't think the Indian civil service is a meritocracy anymore, right? I mean, I was born and brought up in Kashmir, so I wish Patel had won over Nehru in the Kashmir discussion. But in the civil services discussion, Patel won. But, Nehru used to say the Indian civil service is neither Indian nor civil nor a service. Right? So I think that there was a huge time after independence that the Indian civil service structure serviced India well. 560 Maharajas were integrated. We put together this country. But I think now the steel frame is becoming a steel cage, and we need a more adventurous state. And the current state is not set up to be adventurous.
Yeah. I think I take your point on, the IPL unleashing a wave of talent and innovation. Yes. And I think we see that in multiple other areas. For example, if you look at over the top, it's an explosion of opportunity for actors. So it's the same kind of a phenomena as the IPL. Now the hegemony of a few select actors. I think so I really hope that, the steel cage, as you call it, becomes a very different. We have an OTT kind of a phenomena happening with the steel cage. One particular question I can't, resist asking this question is that, I mean, when we talk of building $1 trillion digital economy, personally, one of the big concerns I have is that, and I'm an investor in Google, for example, but with the pandemic, what we have seen is a kind of a K-shaped recovery. The digital businesses are growing by leaps and bounds. The TCSs and the Infosys and Wipros and saying that we have more demand than we can handle. And at the ground level, there is devastation in terms of loss of jobs. So how can we build a more just and equitable digital ecosystem which takes people at the bottom of the pyramid also along with us? Over maybe quick answers, because I think we are another 15 minutes away. So
I want to you go first, ma'am.
Okay. So first of all, that's precisely what I meant when I said, we have to have digital infrastructure. Yeah. Why are we not able to take these people along? If you look at the last 2 years, who are the students that have actually managed to still learn, and which are the students that have just fallen behind? They've even forgotten the habit of going to school. So, it's the rural masses, it's the more deprived section of society that have not been able to afford the digital tools that have really fallen behind. And therefore, you can't blame the fact that there's a K-shaped recovery. As I said, we need higher and higher skill levels. The manual jobs of the past will get done by machines, will get done by robots. What we really need are jobs, are people who are willing to be able to use their minds and their skills in order to upgrade whatever they are doing. And that's where the demand is. I told you that, even in just a small company like Salesforce, compared to the rest of the behemoths in India, some 20,000 jobs would be open at this point of time. And yet, on the other hand, you're saying there are people without jobs. Why is that? Because the skill gap exists. We have not really built a proper way of ensuring that our education system addresses this to the last mile. That is something that we really and truly need to do. Not only that, if you want to give those urban amenities, if you remember, President Kalam used to talk about this, provision of urban amenities in rural areas. It was Pura was one of his, favorite topics to talk about. How can we actually do that to all of the people unless and until we have the digital infrastructure? So whether it be the best of medicine, whether it be the best of pedagogy, all of this can be delivered in a very, very uniform way if we have the digital platforms on which this can ride. So you don't need, that many experts in a particular area of, say, medicine in order to be able to get the diagnostics out to the rural areas if you have the digital infrastructure on which all of this can ride. Okay, it's the same with education. If you look at pedagogy, you have the best of materials, but it is restricted in a few schools. Now, if you had the platforms whereby everybody would be able to access it, I don't think it would be rocket science in order to ensure that it gets delivered into the rural areas as well. So the communication network, the ability for those people to access these things becomes very, very important. Not only that, what it also does is, for the first time in the digital world, everything can be hyper-personalized. So, the same lessons that you can learn, probably I will need a day more to learn. So, my program can be differentiated from your program. And as you do that, you ensure far better learning and therefore far better outcomes. So there is a lot that can be done actually if we expand the digital network. And I think, today it is not only a question of commerce, it's also a question of, social engineering that needs to be done in order to get that digital infrastructure out there, in order to empower all of our people. The K-shaped recovery is something that should not happen. I personally believe that, a society that is not inclusive is not a sustainable society. And I often give this very small example that, happened in school, that one of our teachers, she was teaching us social sciences and she wanted to talk about the social fabric. And somebody asked her, what does that really mean? And the next day she actually landed up with a piece of fabric, okay, a thin piece of fabric. She had four of us, hold it at four corners. And then she took a pencil and asked somebody to push it up the center. Okay, like it went up like a tent. Now, as he kept pushing, the fabric actually tore from that point. So she said, this is exactly the representation. If there is too much of division between the haves and the have-nots, this is what happens. You cannot have a stable society if that happens. And that is so, it is a image that stays in your mind, because then you realize that this inclusiveness is so important. And in an India that is as populous a country as we are, it is impossible to do it without digital. So digital transformation, therefore, I think it's the bedrock of all that we build on, and it is the bedrock on which we can get a stable society.
I agree there, and I think I would probably add that, when you say digital infrastructure, I think we have done a great job of building the back-end digital infrastructure in terms of India stack. But in terms of the front-end digital infrastructure, the software in Indian languages, getting more devices into the hands of students and people at the bottom of the pyramid, I think there's still a lot to be done. I think, and I hope that the government does focus on that in the next few years. I think it's a crying shame that, despite the fact that we are, in a sense, the IT producing nation of the world, we still don't have, software interfaces in Hindi, Marathi, Gujarati. If you take a list of the top 10 spoken languages in the world, there is, Hindi, Bengali, and so many other languages. But where is the user interface in those languages? So I think that definitely adds to a tremendous amount of exclusion. But let me, have Manish also chime in on this particular aspect, and then we'll take questions from the audience.
I mean, the lack of inclusion between elites and masses in India was a pre-existing condition of COVID. COVID didn't do this, right? So I'm a little surprised when people were surprised about migrants the Indian economy, the Indian migrant behaved exactly as you would expect, right? Because we are inadequately formalized, urbanized, industrialized, financialized, and human capital. See, there's no such thing as poor people. There are people in poor places. An electrician who moves from Patna to Bangalore gets 4 times more salary. A plumber who moves from Nigeria to the US gets 25 times more salary. So the pathology is not with the place, it is with the individual, right? And you can't take jobs to people, you have to take people to jobs in the short run. So I think just formalizing India, 63 million enterprises only translate to 23,500 companies with paid up capital. I think industrializing India, we can't have 2% of our labor force on farms. They only produce 14% of GDP. We have to, the only way to help farmers is to have less farmers. I think financialization credit to GDP ratio has been stuck at 50% for a long time for various reasons. I don't think China's 300% credit to GDP ratio is the right number, but 100% is what we need to get to. And obviously, the digitization of payments has happened. Hopefully, the digitization of credit is on the horizon, at least it seems to be. I think urbanization, we only have 52 cities with more than 1 million people. We should have 200. Shoving more people into Delhi, Bombay, Bangalore is not the way for prosperity. We need to shove them into Ludhiana, Jammu, and other places. So I think, the agenda is quite clear, and it's not fiscal and monetary policy. If fiscal deficits made countries rich, then no country would be poor. And I haven't made up my mind about monetary policy on whether it's a placebo or a painkiller or a steroid. It's surely not a solution to India's poverty. The only solution to India's poverty is a structural transformation of our land, labor, capital, and how it combines. In fact, we don't have a shortage of land, labor, capital. It's the fourth factor of production, which is really innovation or entrepreneurship, right? Most people think that there are 3 factors of production: land, labor, capital. But actually, it's the fourth one, which economists call TFP, is really the challenge for India. We have enough land. You could give every Indian household half an acre and they would fit into Rajasthan and half of Maharashtra. We don't have a shortage of labor. 40% of our labor force is Vela. We don't have a shortage of capital, as the unicorn phenomena is showing. But what we have a challenge in how this land, labor, capital combines to create high-paying jobs or wage employment. It's that innovation, that entrepreneurship, which obviously this digitization is an accelerant for India. It's a rocket in some sense. But, even if software employment doubles, it'll be 10 million out of the 550 million labor force. So 0.8% of our labor force today produces 8% of GDP. It's a wonderful oasis of high productivity. But the jobs we need will be sales, service, logistics, customer service. China's farm to non-farm transition happened to factories. India's is happening to sales. Sales is the fastest growing job in India, all kinds of sales. And so I think that, the inclusiveness of India will go up with a structural transformation. Some of it is underway, some of it we still have to do.
Thanks. What I'll do is I'll quickly take some questions from the audience. I think we have just a few minutes to go. In your opinion, and just 2 minutes, quick answers, what kind of government incentives are necessary to reach $1 trillion economy? Maybe Manish would go first.
No, ma'am, Ms. Patel, please go ahead.
See, if you just look at, for instance, you're talking about AI in China. Now, frankly speaking, everybody knows that, the larger the data sets, better will be the responses or the guidances that come out of AI tools, okay? How do you handle such large data sets if you're not on the cloud? You can't do it. It's way, way too expensive. All right. Now look at the incentives that the Singapore government has been giving in order to use cloud technology. And look at India and where we are. There is still so much of wrong perception regarding cloud and security and whether you should be there or should not be there. Though, the government showed huge courage in taking the entire CoWIN on the cloud, on the public cloud. And that's the reason it could be stood up in such short time.
Yeah.
So the fact of the matter is, what are the incentives? There have to be regulatory and policy incentives that tell you that adoption of your latest technology is something that we respect and which we will incentivize, not put, too many guardrails against. And not only that, regulatorily, if you look at, for instance, again, I have to quote Singapore in this. Singapore regulator, that is the financial regulator, is the only one that also used to have a business development department. A regulator having a business development department. I have dealt with them personally and been very, very impressed. But the fact of the matter is that is not something, the regulators feel is part of their mandate. But what it does is, if you are there, is it helps you stay ahead of the curve. It doesn't, then you are not catching up with the innovations, catching up with things. Yes, we have a sandbox, but who really owns it? Who really ensures that, that is something that is actively promoted so that you're actively promoting innovation, as Mr. Sabharwal was talking about? Because innovation is what, what is going to keep us ahead of the race. If that doesn't happen, we are going to be, left behind. Having said that, I must also say, I don't think that we have a country as good in frugal innovation as we have in India. The amount of frugal innovation I have seen is, and it is not jugaad, okay? It is not jugaad that I'm talking about. I'm talking about true innovation in the right way, in the right manner, but with the minimum amount of resources. It can be done in India. We have those kinds of entrepreneurs. Indians have been entrepreneurial all their lives, because of which you will find Indian entrepreneurs in every corner of the world. So the fact is, we have to give them the incentives and the policies and the confidence that the policies, that the rules of the game will not change, while the dance is on. It's okay to put as tough a rule as you want up front, but you don't change the rules, as the game is going on. So there are a number of these things, which where the perception needs to be set right by consistent action. And if that happens, surely, I don't think there should be difficulties in achieving the goals that we are wanting to achieve.
Manish, quick thoughts from you. I think we have 2-3
I mean,
minutes.
I'm not a big believer in incentives. I think the PLI system is a bribe that we had to give to manufacturers to overcome other costs. But if we can do ease of doing business, if we can do human capital, if we can do infrastructure, that's the best incentive you can give to us. Indian entrepreneurs don't need incentives, they need freedom. Give me Purna Swaraj from UGC in education. Give me Purna Swaraj from the regulatory cholesterol. And I think the unicorns and many
one thing, Mr. Sabharwal, I was not meaning incentives in the form of money. Incentives
I
is in
was
the
talking
form
about
of freedom. Incentives is in the form of freedom to experiment, the freedom to go ahead and do things. That's the incentive.
Yes.
There is no question of, having to give a subsidy or anything or the other. That's not sustainable, nor is it warranted, nor is it required. People don't want it either. All that they need is the ability to have consistent policies and the freedom to experiment and to go ahead.
Yes. Perfect.
Manish, 2 minutes.
No, I was just responding to the question because the incentive question comes up again and again. I mean, the US fiscal deficit this year is more than our GDP. I mean, I don't think that makes sense. I mean, that's not the way India can go. We entered the COVID with a 70% public debt to GDP ratio. We will exit it with a 90% plus public debt to GDP. So, the most important question, Jonas Salks, he was the inventor of the polio vaccine, he used to say, the most important question to ask yourself is, are you being a good ancestor? And I think the best way we can be good ancestors is by creating this India where innovation and entrepreneurship flourishes. And for that, you just reduce regulatory cholesterol, improve human capital, and build the infrastructure.
Thanks so much, Manish. Thanks, Mrs. Bhattacharya. I hope that we can soon transform the steel cage of the civil service into a let's say an open playground in which Indian entrepreneurs can play. And I think unleashing the enthusiasm of our people will really uh, spark off the kind of innovation that we see in IPL, the kind of innovation that we have seen in over the top, the number of new actors coming in. I think so. Thank you so much. I think both of you are among the best people that we could have had on this panel for talking about how can we take India to a $1 trillion economy. Thank you so much for your inputs.
Thank you.
Thanks, Venkatesh.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Wonderful to
Thank
see you
you.
again.
Thank you, Mr. Sabharwal.